home building activity at the moment is low because interest rates rose. It's a very uninteresting story. The day it started, you know what happens. Home building slows down, people tighten their finances. That's not the interesting story. The interesting story is what's happened over the course of the past 20 years. And when governments ask, why aren't we building enough homes? What's changed? And it is, in this case, 25 years of continuous constraints. And yes, that story of who pays to make water flow uphill is a critical determinant of how many homes we build. And to do it anecdotal, if we go back to the 1970s, there was a Department of Main Works or a similar public infrastructure agency that built all of the infrastructure for new greenfields. So I'm just going to do greenfields as a easier metaphor than brownfields, but built all the infrastructure, and those buying a block of land didn't pay for the cost of that infrastructure. It was paid through consolidated revenue or through other ongoing user charges for water, electricity, road user charges, and others. In the 1990s, we started to switch to a user pays system. And then in its worst case scenario, which is in New South Wales, not only was then 100% cost recovery from about the year 2000 onwards, New South Wales then added in developer charges, developer fees, and we've seen that then proliferate in other jurisdictions as well. So a new home buyer has to pay for 100% of the cost of the infrastructure for their home and then gets taxed on that as well. And then they kept going. Now they also have to pay upfront for the cost of the infrastructure for other users downstream from them. And then they get taxed on that as well. And then they added in the cost of building parks, roads, services, and in maintaining those parks and roads and services in perpetuity, and charging those fees up front and putting taxes on top of those, including stamp duty and GST. And so that question of who pays to make water flow uphill, because at some stage you either have to make sewage flow uphill to get to a treatment plant, or you need potable water to flow uphill for services. If we can answer that question, and if you genuinely think it is equitable to make someone building a new home, then they're just 200,000 households out of 11 million households, pay for the provision of public goods and public infrastructure, and sometimes for the provision of public housing that is for the public good, upfront, and tax them on that. That inequity is how we've arrived at the inequity whereby we have an acute shortage of rental stock, rapid increases in house prices, which lead to all of the poor economic outcomes. And consequently, we're going to see, unless they can increase that supply of housing, we end up with poor government policies as a result. Just coming to work this morning, listening to a politician talk about mandating what investors should be providing to a tenant, have to provide heating and cooling and so forth, and also talking about capping rents simultaneously. It is in these cycles where we get bad public policy outcomes unless we can get through, unless we can solve that question. And it is moving those costs back to consolidated revenue. And we saw the South Australian government just a couple of months ago make a really smart policy decision whereby they are going to, for new development lots in greenfields, they are sharing the equity across consolidated revenue for a third of it, the developer on a third, and water users for the other third. And that shared equity arrangement, shared cost burden, is a very effective mechanism at freeing up both capital infrastructure and land in order to improve the supply. Detached is an important component, not the only component, as I mentioned before. Apartments are the other component. But if we can solve the greenfields problem, then we can go a long way to solving the brownfields problem as well.
Wow, there's so much in there. Let's see if we can rewind a little bit on that stuff, because it is so incredibly critical what you've just talked about, Tim, because the poor old property investors getting largely the blame for why there's a housing affordability issue. But what you're saying is, can we rewind a little bit back to, you talked about the 70s and the 80s. It's just these little incremental decisions that get made that we look back in the rear vision mirror and go, that's something we shouldn't have done. But you talked to the South Australian example just then, but how do we unwind some of those incremental steps in the other states to mirror what South Australia is doing? Because everyone would be addicted to the amount of taxes that they're collecting, and to unwind that, even incrementally, would be taking some time and probably some votes.
Yeah, so we'll first do no harm, and that's particularly targeted at the moment for Victoria, where the introduction of land taxes on secondary properties and the introduction of short-term rental accommodation, that it's very nice to think that taking Airbnb and putting it onto the long-term market is going to do anything to adjust supply and demand, but of course it doesn't. So yes, we have to stop governments trying to tax their way through this. If you put a tax on carbon, you will get less carbon. If you put a tax on homes in any way, you're going to reduce the supply of homes. So that's a first focus. On the second focus, there were the longer term issue of how we get them off their addiction to taxing homes. That long-term tax reform process is warranted, and immediately people go to the GST and stamp duty, and that is a very important component. It is going to take, I think that we're more likely to achieve reform of the Senate than we are to see reform of the GST in that light. And so yes, unpicking those smaller tax imposts, the developer charges, the developer fees, the additional surcharges on foreign investors, all of those individual components, if we can continue to chip away at those without adding new ones, and of course, it's negative year-end capital gains tax will cycle back around eventually, and preventing an increase in tax on any cohort is important, as well as moving towards that goal of reducing the existing imposts.
Tim, can we lift the hood a little bit on public benefit? Can you help our audience understand better why should those costs, which I don't disagree, but why should those costs be shared amongst more people? How does someone get a public benefit from someone who's building in a new house? Can you unpack that a bit further, please?
Yeah, well, let's take this lovely term called inclusionary zoning, and I'm taking the extreme, and that is where those building new homes have to pay for 100% of the cost of providing public housing stock. And that's inequitable because only 200,000 households build a new home, and there is 11 million Australian households, therefore everybody should be bearing the cost. But likewise, when the provision of roads, parks, public infrastructure services that are available for all residents of a city, it's not equitable to impose those costs on just those that are residing in a new residential suburb. Building of transport infrastructure, roads, trains, the likes, that is services that are available to all residents within that area or not within that taxpayer region. And if you impose them, you create such a significant barrier that you will prevent that development and economic activity. Now, economic activity in itself isn't the end goal, but while we have 550,000 net overseas migration, the government haven't found the right balance there between stable and reliable migration growth and unconstraining restrictions on new home build. And that's how, at the moment, that affordability problem is being exacerbated.